Welcome, Jaime. Do you hear us?
Yes. Was
Good.
this? I could.
Good. So thank you very much for joining us fairly early, but not beating Maria, who joined us at 3 in the morning from Lima. And we wanted, I'm not going to spend time, our time is very short, and I'm not going to spend time introducing you because you were introduced the other day, former Minister of Education from 2013 to 2016 in Peru, now World Bank Education Director. But we wanted to give an opportunity to everyone here to put questions and reactions about the reform experience in Peru directly to one of the architects and, I would say, main implementer. So the floor is open to questions. Lance, you get...
Are we going to take, you're going to take several?
We take, let me see, like 3 or 4 questions. And also from Abuja. Anyone else? Paul Glevy? And anyone else? Dave Evans? The usual suspects, Zingai Mutumbuka? Okay, it's all World Bank ex-colleagues. Okay, let's get some other perspective in here, please. Anyone else?
And all those people should answer questions, not ask me questions.
Ex-World Bank. Yes,
Ex-World Bank, I see. Yeah.
Okay, so Jaime, I want to ask you 2 questions. One, once when I was in Peru talking to you, you had this really wonderfully presentation of your comprehensive reform. And I said to you, but Jaime, you know that certain parts of this, the evidence is just overwhelming that it doesn't make any difference. And you go, yeah, but it has to be part of an overall package in order to get it through. So look, if we have to have as part of our 4-part plan, one part that I don't really believe in, that doesn't necessarily, but which enhances the optics and makes the whole thing, it's worth it. And I just, as I've been managing RISE over the years, I one time consulted a very politically savvy friend of mine about something that I was gonna have to end up approving something that I didn't believe in. And he was like, how naive are you? If you are not planning on spending 10% of your budget on stuff you don't believe in to lubricate the gears and keep the whole thing going, you're just radically naive at how you actually get anything done. So first of all, how much should we expect to have to compromise on comprehensiveness and include things that we don't fundamentally believe in order to put together a sellable package? Second, a question that came up from Kane Rolliston yesterday, as we were sort of discussing something, was how much of resistance is genuinely sincere, but people maintaining false beliefs about what's actually going to work and be responsible progress? So how much opposition is well-meaning but misguided, and how much of it is vested interest? And I know in the Peruvian experience, part of it was just radically vested, narrow vested interests. But I think if we approach it that way and not keep in mind that there are a whole bunch of people that could be persuaded and it's kind of just misguidedness, it makes the way in which we frame things different. So how much, it's like, how do we cope with the vested interest? How do we cope with the misguided? And what do you think are the real obstacles to reform? So those 2 questions.
Those are 2 questions.
2 questions, yes. Those were 2 questions.
Maybe not everyone who's the director of the RISE program can ask 2 questions. Zingai?
But you and I have talked a lot about the need to come out with 2 or 3 indicators that would be universally accepted, like they do in health, infant mortality, and so forth, which would actually give you a very clear idea about the quality of education or the standard of education in the country. Have you done any further thinking on this? Because as we come to the close of RISE, I think this is a very appropriate time to raise the temperature a little bit and help guide people who are struggling with these questions.
Good, thank you. Paul?
Yeah, this is a very specific question. In the presentation you gave a couple hours ago, Barbara, you mentioned that the unions, teacher unions in Peru were not very strong compared to Mexico. And I think that probably is true with India and maybe Sri Lanka or Nepal. And I'm just wondering if Jaime has any, is that what he was able to do in Peru? Do you think you could have done that in Mexico or India, where the teacher unions maybe are harder to deal with?
And Dave?
Yeah, so I'm just curious from your experience as minister, what you see as the most productive role for external researchers and external bodies, not even just civil society within country, but sort of what's the most productive role to support evidence-based reforms?
That he was a civil society researcher before he became minister in World Bank. And I have one question. With the benefit of hindsight, what one or two things would you have done differently?
Okay. So how many hours do we have to answer these questions, Barbara?
Actually, 8 minutes and 54 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, now that I have exactly land in my screen. So land, please answer yes to an email that I just sent you. Just small detail. So let me, Jesus, I don't know where to start. Let me pick this randomly, very quickly. First on the teachers union thing that Paul was asking, very much more difficult to do it in Mexico. I mean, this is sometimes, I mean, reforms require exploiting a political window of opportunity that might arise or not. And in this case, and this is something that we have been discussing even until a few hours ago with Barbara, the teachers union was weakened. The teachers union in Peru was the strongest union in Peru, right? Yes, it's weak compared to other unions in Latin America. It's weaker than the Mexican union. However, what was important is the dynamics along time. And what had happened in the case of Peru is that even before this reform started with the previous government, I mean, there was the previous government actually paved the way because they installed the perception with public opinion that teachers were in part culprit of the low quality of education, right? So yes, there's a problem, okay, and the problem is the teachers, right? And actually that weakened the union in the sense that then the public opinion was not like sympathetic to union movement, right? Or was not sympathetic to the union saying, okay, we're gonna do a huge strike. So that was when we installed the idea of meritocracy universally, and we said, look, teachers have to be evaluated or assessed. Then parents and public opinion was, yes, well, that's a good idea, right? So you will have the media saying, yeah, that's a good idea. Teachers have to be assessed, right? And it has been very difficult to move out of that idea, even by now, even like whatever 8 years after that reform was passed. So it's not the relative power also, but it's what happens with the power of the union a long time, and what's the power of the union vis-a-vis public perception. There are too many questions here, so
Asking about the learning poverty measurement.
Yeah,
Something,
I think
some simple indicator that.
I think, and that allow me to move for 1 minute outside Peru and globally. I think education, the world of education, does not have the 1.5 degree that climate change has, right? And that it's not about rallying the education community, the people who are sitting here in the room, right? It's about rallying public opinion in general, politicians, congressmen, etc. Right? Those are the people who matter. Those who are not the experts in education, right? They don't care about, well, really, it's about that only single indicator, say, of learning poverty. No, but if you have a compelling narrative for them that will convince them that you're a crisis, that there's a crisis, and they need to act upon the crisis, that's enough, right? That's enough, and that's the part that we do not have on education. I mean, it's very important with the point that Lance was saying about the mix between things that you don't fundamentally believe and the things that are critical. Yes, it's right, it's true. You need to be pragmatic. But I think we are, in general, in education, we're very lucky that we don't have to do too many things, right, that are fundamentally wrong, because what we need to correct in education is really the basics in many cases, right? So now there are some things, let me give just one quick example. Some things that you say, well, but this is borderline, this is the best use of resources, given that you're in a relatively poor country, right? The high performing schools, right? That we did, the colegios de alto rendimiento, kind of boarding schools for very talented poor people, right? That for some, that will give you an IB degree, right? But paid with public scholarships. And if you're poor, you could access that. Well, it was the most important thing to do vis-a-vis the many other things that you needed to do? Not necessarily, but it gave you a signal that you could achieve excellent things within public education, right? So, and that was useful, right? It was the most important, not necessarily. It was bad? No, it was not bad. But that helps me to answer the question that your Lance's second question, which was about genuinely well-meant criticism. That was, for instance, for those high-performing schools, that many people in the education community said, no, that's a big mistake because that's against equity. Or other people in the education community will say, oh, no, lesson plans is not a great idea. Structured pedagogy is not a great idea because that kills teachers' creativity, right? So those are well-meant criticisms, right? And you can discuss about that. But I mean, you still need to manage that. There is some of that. Yes, there is some of that. Was that the most difficult to handle? No, because I mean, the fuel that you have to try to tackle that is probably larger than the fuel that you have in order to tackle all those other criticisms that are just plain vested interests. That, right? I think from the perspective of the teams, it is more time consuming, or it feels much more like a burden to fight the vested interest or the vested interest related criticism than to fight the well-meant criticisms, even if you disagree with those well-meant criticisms. So yeah, you need to manage both, but I mean, the vested interest related ones consume much more of your energy, your time, your bandwidth, and actually end up being much more complicated to handle. Finally, let me see, what would have done differently? I think one thing that would have been important to start earlier was pre-service teachers reform, right? That was part of the agenda, but that started too late and never picked up really, right? And I think it was a mistake not to give that the same weight than to the reform of the career in terms of changing the teacher incentives, assessing teachers, supporting teachers in service. That's fine. Well, of course, you need to do that, but I think the reforms of pre-service should start as early as possible. And let me stop there.
So, Dave's Evan's question about external researchers.
So no, I think the only point in terms of external researchers is that they must be willing to give advice with whatever knowledge exists at that moment. And I think Dave is very good at that. So he's doing a great job. So because sometimes there are things that we don't know, right? But if you have to take a decision today, for the research is much better to say at that moment, well, really, I mean, don't expose what you don't know. Great, but that's for another moment. Expose what's the best advice with what you know at that moment, right? So you need to distinguish those two moments. The moment in which you say, what's the best that I can say with what I know as of today? And when is that I can give the whole picture and say what I know and what is really that are still pending questions. Okay, we need to distinguish when's the right moment to use one role and when's when's the right moment to use the other role in which you bring in everything that you still don't know.
On behalf of all of us, thank you for sharing so much of what you know. And
sorry, it's difficult to be articulated in 7 minutes with rich questions were probably the subject of an entire week of discussion.
Maybe you should write a book about your experience with the wisdom and.
yes, we think that's a very good idea. Thank you all. I'm a little sorry this had to be so short, but I think it was better than nothing. Thank you. Thanks, Jaime.
I think he didn't hear me because he has in fact written a book.
Yeah.
He has a draft of a book that will be out soon that will inform about his experience as a minister. So we're all looking forward to it.
Actually, Mike, so you're good. We can maybe just stay here, probably. Okay, great. We will go ahead and jump right into our next session with many thanks to Jaime for jumping in on that. So this session is best known as the Kovid Session. We had to have one. As is obvious to everyone in this room, I mean, obviously the pandemic and the school closures are going to have repercussions for the education space for decades to come. So this really is a critical topic to grapple with intently. I think there's a lot of work being done on how the things we already knew can be applied. There's a lot of work being done on what new things we're learning, both while schools were closed and as they start to reopen, that we can use to address current learning losses, but also that maybe carry lessons with them that we can take into the future with us. And so we have a great panel here that's going to enlighten us of some of the latest on these kinds of areas. And just a note, I've spent a fair bit of time in the last 2 years analyzing data on learning losses, and it's mostly very depressing. So we do have, I think, maybe a touch of optimism at least one place in the panel. So don't worry, it won't all be dire, although there will be plenty of that. So we're going to first hear from Dave Evans, who's going to give us kind of a broad look at what evidence has emerged on learning losses and school dropout globally as a result of the pandemic and the school closures. And then we're going to dive in a bit deeper into a few specific contexts. So we get to hear again from Abhijeet on new work on learning losses and some different recovery efforts that are being tried in India. We're going to hear from Julius Atahura on parental involvement in children's education in Uganda, and how the dynamics between head teachers, and parents changed during and as a result of school closures. And then finally, we will hear online remotely from Sarah Kabe on the role of parental engagement in children's education during the distance learning in Côte d'Ivoire. And she's going to pick up on some of the equity implications there and parental views on distance learning experiences and the approaches that were tried there. So with that, I will go ahead and hand over to Dave to take it away.
Thank you very much. It is great to be here and to sort of set the stage a little bit for the country-specific research that we're going to hear about in the subsequent presentations. So as Michelle mentioned, some of you might have noticed that we've been in a pandemic for the last couple of years. and it might have had a little bit of an impact in the education sector. So what I'm going to talk about is some work that Laura Moscoviz and I did, trying to figure out what we know in terms of the impacts of this crisis so far on learning loss and dropout. Now, learning loss, I don't need to defend that outcome to this group. Obviously, these are the fundamental skills that children are hopefully taking away from school. And then dropout rates, the reason we focus on this is that obviously as children drop out of school, they curtail their learning careers, A. And then B, we also know that there are some benefits that accrue to kids just from being in school, even if the quality isn't that high. So as they drop out, some of the benefits that we know about in terms of child survival and deferred adolescent pregnancies and things like that, we also lose some of those opportunities. So I'll talk about both of those outcomes if I can fit it all in. So we basically found, as of a couple of months ago, earlier this year, we found 40 studies estimating learning loss, 29 studies on learning loss, 15 studies on dropout. My numeracy isn't so poor that I don't know that 29 and 15 don't add up to 40. Obviously, there are a number of studies that measure both of these. So fundamentally, we learned three things, after which you can go back to your email if you don't want to hear all the details. First is that we don't know how much learning has been lost or how many kids have dropped out in the vast majority of countries in the world. So we actually still know very little about this. Since we did this, we've been tracking newer studies that have come out. There's still just very little knowledge on this. And so I think that's, in whatever takeaways we have here, I think it's important to recognize that they don't, that any inference we make about the whole world is exactly that. A bold inference. The second is that average measured learning loss has varied dramatically across countries. And so most studies do find learning loss, but the levels and the amount is huge. But the thing that we found that was most consistent is that there is always learning loss and always increased dropouts amongst the poorest kids. And in every place that measured it, they tend to be much higher than those for richer kids. And so, yes, there is a global problem, but there is a disaster for the most vulnerable kids in the countries that we work in. I lost the rest of my slides. I don't know. That's a good one. Oh. Okay, yeah, right? No. I can do it anyway. So here's what we found fundamentally, and I don't know if we can sort of explore some technical options. But there were slides in a Dropbox folder and in an email, so somewhere in there might be all the slides. I don't know. So here's what we found. So the first thing is, we did a search, essentially what you'd imagine. We searched for, any studies that measured learning loss, any studies that measured dropout rates, and we looked for these studies in both high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries. Obviously, this group is principally interested in what we learn from low and middle-income countries, but the fact of the matter is most of the evidence on learning loss that we've gotten so far is still from high-income countries. And so, there's a useful contrast here with high-income countries. On the one hand, you have, on average, obviously there are exceptions to this. In high-income countries, you have more remote access, and so there are more kids who have access to Zoom classrooms and Google classrooms where they're digital, but they're actually interacting. Whereas in lower-income countries, often, kids are listening to a radio program or watching some very quickly recorded TV show. And so that's, one difference. On the other hand, the average productivity of learning tends to be higher in higher income countries. And so in that sense, it's not obvious what the net effect would be of those two effects, right? We might see less learning loss in high income countries because there's better access, but we might see more because kids generally just learn more when they're in school relative to kids in a very low income context. So we do this search. We find studies across the world. We find studies so in terms of learning loss, we find a number of studies, obviously in North America, in Europe, and then a number of countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And then for dropout rates, so the majority, about 2/3 of the studies that we find on learning loss are in high-income countries. For dropout rates, as you can imagine, virtually all the studies that we find are for low and middle-income countries. High-income countries just aren't that worried about dropout rates as we get at least up to secondary school. And so, that's the first thing that we take away, and you can see this beautiful map that I've made. Just kidding. But what we find is if you pool the outcomes, learning loss and dropout rates, we have estimates for 13% of countries in the world. Right? And if I were to update that number, you know, since we wrote this paper a couple months ago, maybe that's gone up to 15%, right? So that is just, again, like a tiny proportion of the world. And in many of the countries that we're talking about, we're looking at subnational samples, right? These aren't necessarily nationally representative samples. They're, you know, samples from a quick survey that somebody did. And so, anyway, so that's I would say the number one takeaway is that there's so much left to learn in this area. So let's start with learning loss. So what do we find? In terms of high-income countries, what we see is, who knows? Who knows what's gonna happen? Don't get distracted. Eyes on me. I'm just kidding. Unless there's another 30-second video of like a kid talking about what happens when you, all right, well, let's see what happens here. We'll see if I said anything false. Oh yeah, so the COVID pandemic has been disruptive. I bet you're really sorry you missed that slide. Okay, I'm just gonna skip all this stuff. Okay, oh yeah, I was 1% off, so that's why I need the slides. Okay, so what do we find? So what we find in high-income countries is we see average learning loss in virtually every country. So we see in countries with national samples, like the Netherlands, the UK, the US, multiple studies from the latter two, we see average learning loss often pretty sizable. We see it in subnational samples from Belgium, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, additional studies from the US. So all of these studies find evidence of learning loss. The biggest impacts tend to be amongst primary school kids. So there's a certain intuition to that, I guess, in the sense that, especially in places where you have high connectivity and high access to sort of interactive, Zoom classrooms and this kind of thing, we might expect that older kids are more able to take advantage of that and have like a substantive interaction in their science class virtually, whereas, a kid who's learning to recognize letters and who has the attention span of a 5-year-old or a participant on the 5th day of the RISE conference, might challenge. We also find pretty consistently, there's no clear pattern across countries on the size of the impacts for math scores versus reading scores. And so in some countries I was re-looking at the data this morning, I was like, oh yeah, it looks like, reading's in the lead, oh no, math's in the lead. So it's kind of all over the place in that regard. But we see sizable learning losses in both of these cases. But again, even in high-income countries where we have the best access to education technology, right? We have much worse outcomes for the poorest kids. So in the Netherlands and Italy, 60% higher learning losses for the poorest kids. In Belgium, inequality within schools rose by up to 20%. Big increases in gaps between low poverty and high poverty schools in the US, 2 months slower growth in the least advantaged schools in Australia. Interestingly, again, even in Australia, they didn't find any average learning loss in this initial study, but they still found this increasing inequality, and we'll see that pattern repeat elsewhere. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence that we have from some low and middle income countries. I'm going to talk specifically about a few studies, and then I'll give my sense of the big patterns. So there's a really nice study just came out in Nature Human Behavior that looks at Sao Paulo State in Brazil, school closures of 35 weeks as of the end of 2020. So there's a very rich data environment in order to, in which to evaluate this. So they had quarterly standardized tests that they were administering. So one of the interesting things they find is they first do a naive estimate where they basically just compare the Q4, so the end of the school year tests at the end of 2020 to the end of the school year tests at the end of 2019. And what you can see from the figure up here is that learning actually jumped way up. You're like, yeah, all right. COVID was great for learning. Not so. But I think on the one hand, that's a caution about these naive estimates. If we look, most of the studies that we have to date are exactly this kind of naive estimate, right? You have a measure of learning from a year or 2 years before the pandemic, and you have another measure of learning. Now, the reason I wouldn't use if anything, this would suggest that learning loss estimates may be underestimated in the context of naive estimates. The one caveat I'd put to that is here in Brazil in 2020, they actually had a simplified, they implemented very quickly, or not in Brazil, in Sao Paulo state, a simplified curriculum. And so that could also explain part of the reason test scores jumped, because it was easier. Then they do a more careful estimate. They look at Q1 versus Q4, so the beginning of the year versus the end of the year in 2019 versus 2020. So how much are kids learning over the course of the year? And we see a sizable negative impact on learning. So the kids lose about 0.3 some standard deviations, which the researchers estimate as being about 28%. The kids are learning about 28% of what they would have learned in the absence of these school closures, right? So it's not that they've lost 28%, they're learning about a quarter of what they would have learned otherwise. And these are high school students in Brazil. So if we look at another study in Mexico, so that I would say methodologically in terms of the studies that are out and published, this is one of the best. They've got some of the richest data, and they're able to do some differences comparisons here. Most of these others, again, are more naive estimates, but we still see a lot of evidence of learning loss. So in Mexico, they have 2 household surveys. We'll see this model a few times. In 2018 and 2021, 10 to 15-year-olds in a couple of studies. They use the Mexico adapted, essentially modeled after the ASA or the UESO. And you can see we see sizable drops in, this is percentage of 10-year-olds who can read with comprehension, a familiar metric to many of you. And we can see a big drop both for the richest kids and for the poorest kids. So it's a bigger gap for the poorest kids, but we still see significant loss even amongst the rich kids. I know I've just got a few minutes. South Africa and Bangladesh. I know Nick, who's here, has done a lot of work on the South Africa studies. So in South Africa, there was a 10-week full closure in 2020, delayed reopening in 2021, and then for kids in the youngest grades, there was rotating attendance. So even once schools reopened, the kids weren't attending school full-time. They found as of early 2021 that grade 4 reading kids had learned about a quarter of what they would have learned otherwise, similar to the Brazil estimates of home tongue reading ability, about half of their what they would have learned otherwise in terms of English ability. In Bangladesh, there's some pretty similar, some slightly smaller estimates, but they're looking at adolescent girls and they're using a grade 3 anchored test. And so arguably the researchers themselves are like, well, if we were actually testing closer to grade level, we might see bigger impacts. So those are a lot of kind of dire, depressing stories like Michelle alluded to at the beginning of the session. There are some countries where we aren't seeing big average learning loss. So Uganda, this is from some analysis that Justin Sandler did, building on the UESO Uganda data and analysis. And on average, you almost can't tell because they're so close together, but we have the 2018 estimates, which are the blue circles, and the 2021 estimates, which are the red squares, and you can see that it's basically identical. There's very little change. We definitely don't see any evidence of average learning loss. And then UNESCO did a series of surveys amongst 5th and 6th grade students to see if kids had reached or exceeded minimum proficiency levels in reading. And you can see across 5 countries, but they have a pre-estimate and then they have a 2021 estimate. And you can see, some of them we see an improvement, some of them we see a decrease. All of these levels are very low. None of these changes are big. And so it could be that we've got so few kids in Burundi, so few kids are meeting these levels that it's difficult to lose a lot. And even the high performing countries here, Senegal, it's still under 15%. But we don't see average learning loss in that context. So what we do see is, again, this consistent evidence of heterogeneous impacts. And so we see in Mexico, we already saw that the poorest kids were losing a lot more. In Bangladesh, in Ghana, in Uganda, in all of these contexts, we see big evidence of the worst learners losing. So Uganda, where we saw no average learning loss, we saw doubling in the number of non-readers, kids who couldn't recognize a single letter, which was concentrated amongst the poorest kids. We see very little evidence of gender differences across countries. And so it doesn't seem that's where the learning loss differences are concentrated. So the last thing I'm going to say is on dropout rates, which is just to say we see huge variation in dropout rates, but in some countries we see evidence of very large increases. And so you can see here in Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, and Malawi, we see very large increases. These are mostly, but not entirely, concentrated among adolescents. So mostly these are kids who are, basically missing the last 2 or 3 years of their schooling careers. In South Africa, in this work that Nick Spall led, school dropout tripled from 230,000. And in an adolescent girls study in Kenya, they found a doubled risk of adolescent pregnancy, and not tiny numbers, right? Going from 5% to 10%. So the 3 takeaways, just remember, we still don't know a lot more than we do know. We see a lot of variation. I don't see a single consistent story on average learning loss, but the consistent story we do see is that the most vulnerable kids everywhere, from high-income countries to low-income countries, have lost an enormous amount of reading and math ability, and many of them have curtailed their schooling careers as a result of the pandemic. Thank you.
And extra props to Dave for pulling off the first third of his presentation with no slides. Not many do that. Over to you, Abhijeet.
Hi, so in case you thought you were done with me for the day, you were not. Never indeed. A bad penny shows up, there's something of the kind. One good thing about going after Dave is that this will seem like the Zen talk, right? And there will be a contrast between my last presentation and this one, because the last one we'd been thinking about for 3 years and working for 3 years, and this is going to be me presenting data where we're still scratching our heads trying to make sense of it, but we think it's really important, and that's why we thought that this is exactly the right audience to show this to, and then have some discussion about what do we think we're finding and how we should be interpreting this. So this is going to be about learning loss and COVID, and it's going to be evidence from Tamil Nadu. And that's going to be important because just one state doesn't allow you to fill the full map of India, which is a hill that I'm willing to die on multiple RISE conferences over and over again. Okay, so just some background, right? I mean, everyone was hit by COVID. India got hit really bad. Okay, so it was very severe. By about September 2021, over 3 million people are estimated to have died. We had amongst the longest school closures anywhere in the world. And these were severe household economic shocks, right? So, I mean, we keep talking about school closures, but we have to simultaneously think of the fact that households had severe health shocks, that there were massive lockdowns. It's primarily a country without a safety net. Like, there were lots of very inventive things done in different states, but, households are vulnerable to income shocks. There's lots of things happening, all of which everything would indicate should have led to declines in human capital. Education systems were particularly severely affected because a lot of the economy opened. So schools were first to close and last to open, which is kind of the opposite of what was true in lots of places. And there's been a lot of effort on trying to understand learning loss. As Dave said, there are vast areas where we have absolutely no idea. As always, the only real public good here was provided by Pratham, who in a brief moment when it was possible to do fieldwork in 5 states managed to go back and do some fieldwork. But that's 5 states and not Tamil Nadu. A few things that already came out in Dave's talk. We would think that these kind of effects are going to be really different across different education stages, right? So to miss out on preschool means something quite different from missing out early grades. Risk of dropout varies between early school and if you're in high school and the like. And the last bit is, I think, where we have some version of a contribution. So to be honest, I mean, our contribution, the way we see it, is to provide data for Tamil Nadu, which is important in itself, okay? But the academic contribution is going to be about this bit, which is, it's not clear how persistent these losses are. How quickly do you bounce back from that, even if there are severe losses, okay? So what are we going to do? We're going to provide new evidence for rural Tamil Nadu, and we're going to have multiple rounds of in-person data collection at different stages. And this is important because, like everyone else, we were constrained to doing phone-based interviews, and we discovered we could do so much more with them than we ever imagined before the pandemic, but they are a distinct second best, okay? I mean, and I've done a ton over the last 2 years, more than I had ever imagined I would. But multiple rounds of in-person data collection, and it's a large panel data set. and there's going to be experimental variation in survey timing, right? So we're going to measure, well, you'll see what we're going to measure. But we're going to focus on students of preschool age and early primary schooling age. Now, we think these are ages that are important. Why are these the ages we chose and not other ages? It depends on where you had baselines, okay? But this is the group that would be relevant for the kind of FLN goals that a lot of us are trying to align around right now. Three main questions that, so this is a completely descriptive paper. There is no, well, there's a little bit of identification stuck in. But to a first approximation, this is a descriptive paper. And we're trying to figure out what is the magnitude of the learning loss. We're trying to figure out who exactly, so how does the severity of the learning loss vary across various observable characteristics? And in this age group from about 3 to 7 years of age, how much does it differ by like educational stage within that? And then really the last bit is around how much catch-up is there in learning once schools reopen, right? So that's the broad goal. So the setting is rural Tamil Nadu, and this is life gives you lemon, make lemonade kind of moment. We did an immense baseline in 2019 for an RCT that was going to do some very interesting things about integrating preschool into school. The RCT, the treatment did not happen because COVID happened, okay? But what did happen was that in June to August of 2019, we conducted a census in 220 villages. We tested about 25,000 kids. So everyone in these villages, and this is quite important because as I was saying in the previous session, this is a very dynamic educational marketplace. So some of these kids will go to private preschool, some of these kids will be at home, some of these kids will go to government schools and the like, right? So this is at the household level. The villages are in 4 districts. They actually look pretty similar to Tamil Nadu-wide, rural Tamil Nadu-wide representative data, okay? So, yeah, the treatment did not happen. What we did was, between December 2021 and May 2022, we went and resurveyed all the households we could find. That should say slightly higher than 80%. We resurveyed slightly higher than 80%, not XXX. But that tells you not to compile your slides at the very last minute. I wanted to check that number one last time, okay? Because it's either 80.5 or 81.5, and it doesn't matter. Okay, that's the, and when we went back, we tested all kids between 3 to 10. Why 10? Because, well, we tested kids who were like 7.5 the last time they were getting up to 10. Right? And that includes the ones who have now aged into the sample. Now, where is the little bit of identification coming in? So we randomized households into 2 groups within each village. So why did we do that? Well, 2 things. We wanted to figure out, well, what does catch-up look like? The other was, we're planning this in November 2021. And we have no idea whether a 3rd wave is coming. And everyone's expecting a 3rd wave to come, so we wanted to make sure that we had some estimates in case fieldwork stopped again, as it had each time we had tried anything for the last 18 months, okay? So, but randomly, we assigned half the households to be surveyed early, half the households to be surveyed late. The follow-up data collection's in 3 stages, because Omicron happened. So there was an early follow-up, which is we got a few weeks of fieldwork done here, December 20th to Jan 7th. Note that this includes Christmas and New Year. And, you know, now let me shout out to Indira and Akansha, because that's what they've been doing since December. So we got 1 round of fieldwork done then, and that's about 7,000 odd kids. Then the latter bit of what should have been early follow-up is between sort of Feb and March. And then these guys were all surveyed between March and May, okay? So there's basically 3 rounds of data collection between December and May. The difference between 3 and these other 2 is randomized. The difference between these 2 is not randomized. It's basically caused by Omicron, but it balances on every observable we have, okay? So I'm going to treat it as if these are just randomized, okay? That's a timeline. You guys know what the COVID timeline looked like. Wuhan, schools closed in Tamil Nadu in March 2020, and they did not open until here in November 2021. And then they opened, and then they closed again in January for a bit with Omicron, and then they opened again, okay? And we're doing field work whenever life is open. That's kind of the logic, right? Learning assessments, these are simple assessments on preschool cognition. In 2021, we broadened this across more affluent things. Everything's vertically linked across ages, so it's the same metric. And we're standardizing with reference to 5-year-olds in 2019. Okay, so this is what the 2019 distribution means kind of look like with age in months. Right? So older kids know more, which should be no surprise. We get data in December, this is what life looks like. And this is going back to Dave's point that learning loss doesn't mean that you know less than you did earlier. You know less than what you would have known if there wasn't a shock. Okay, so far, life is going according to our priors. It's actually a shift in gradient. You're learning less with time as, in the absence of schooling. So far, life was looking fine. And then here's this kind of surprise. We go back in Feb, and we're converging, and converging kind of rapidly. So there are still learning losses. The difference between August and Feb is very different from August and sort of what we thought in December. Remember, we're adjusting for age at all points. So it's not just that kids are older. And then we go back in sort of April, May. So this is last month. We've covered 2/3 of the gap. Just to give you some sign of how big these losses are, in December, these losses are like 0.6 or so of a standard deviation. Like, these are huge, right? And they were meeting everything that we thought we would that we expected to get. What we weren't expecting was this catch-up. Now, it seems as if, so obviously, like in 19, we didn't test anyone who was older than 7 years, 11 months, so we can't give you a baseline. But the catch-up really seems like that across primary schooling, right? I mean, because now we have this. And it seems to be there in language. So everything I was showing you was math, but it's also there in language. Now, when you see something that you don't expect, the first instinct is, did I mess something up? Right? Did we measure something wrong? Did I get code wrong? And I spent a lot of time just trying to figure this out. It doesn't seem to be, right? I mean, like, whatever is happening in a data, it's not floor and ceiling effects in testing. Same kind of thing happens at different quantiles. It's not failures in IRT linking, like you look at individual items, it kind of looks like that. It doesn't seem to be limited ranges of items tested. So in 2021, like, we have really nicely done tests. They distribute really well. It's not one of those, okay? How should we think about this? The rapid recovery actually, I mean, it's there in the data. And this is last month, so I haven't fully let it seep in exactly how we should think about this. I was expecting some catch-up, simply because everything you do in preschools, there's some convergence, right? You do really great positive things, you know you will fade out a little bit. You do negative things, you mostly converge. So some of this, I think, you could justify by that. But actually, and because we've been embedded in these contexts for a while, and we've been working with the government, some of this at least is about other things that are happening in Tamil Nadu at the moment, right? So, and that's why it says Tamil Nadu and it does not say India, because this is kind of specific. So what's happening in Tamil Nadu in this period? Well, one is because at each of these times, there's a detailed household survey about exactly what inputs are happening at the household level, in schools, in outside of schools. Well, one is that even though schools were open in December when we were asking, 1/3 of the household said, oh, well, they're not. And it seemed like enough parents weren't yet sending their kids in. By Feb, April, everyone thinks it's open, right? There are two things. One is that Tamil Nadu reoriented what they were teaching in schools to largely be a bridge session from January to March, right? I mean, they decided early on, these 3 months, let's just treat it as remedial instruction, and next year we'll get back to normal. So that's what was happening in schools, in the government schools at least. And at the same time, they started what is, I think so to my knowledge, within India, the largest after-school instruction remedial program, right? So they hired 180,000 volunteers to develop this emergency response system. It's essentially a separate cadre. The reason it's politically feasible, it's an emergency response thing. This is not meant to stay. It was meant to end in July. It's going to go on until December. And it's 60 to 90 minutes of supplementary lessons between 5 to 7 p.m. So it's meant to be in the evening. And it was motivated by, we need to fix learning loss. This is a big deal. That's where they were getting. And it's essentially graduates, right? So various graduates in villages. Employment got hit as well right? So it's a vote winner. Now, given near universal rollout, we do not have causal effects here, but I think it's important to, what we do have is we measured quite a lot. Do you know about this? Do you know where this happens? Does your kid go? How often do they go? How many hours do they go for? Stuff like that. And this is big, and the reason we knew to build this in was that we were in talks about can we evaluate it, and the government was very sure they could do it universally. We're like, well, if you can do it universally, it would be way unethical for us to ask for a holdout group. We were convinced that they wouldn't be able to do it universally and there'll be something left for us to RCT over afterwards. Turns out they could, okay? In our villages, 90% of households have heard about it. 60% of them say our kid goes there. Poorer kids are more likely to go there. That's partly because a lot of the motivation is through government schools. Poorer kids go to government schools. Their teacher tells them you should also go to this evening thing. So as a result, poorer kids actually access this more. And of those attending, like 90+% say, yeah, my kid goes more than 4 days a week. Now, we haven't gone and checked it, but it really does seem to be something there. Reminder, none of this says anything about the causal effect of ITK. This is me saying you shouldn't think of this as external validity across India. And then heterogeneity, which, yeah, I'll be fine. There's 10 seconds, that's fine. Right, heterogeneity, the way we do this, we predict what you would have known based on if life had looked like in 2019, and then think of the deviation from that prediction as learning loss. Heterogeneity is really modest, right? So there are 3 cuts. So across gender, it's really modest. Across SES, it's really modest. Across maternal education, it's really modest. These cuts are things that divide things in like half the sample, roughly, so that we have power, but nada. Heterogeneity is just not the first order thing. The first order thing here is that there seems to be catch-up. We did not expect catch-up. We certainly did not expect catch-up of these magnitudes, and I do not yet know what to tell you about why this catch-up happened, but it seemed important enough as a descriptive to be sharing with this group. And the one thing that I am willing to put a stake and say is that if we think we've figured out what COVID-19 did by doing 1 round at the end of like when schools just open, we have not. It'll take us at least a year, 2 years to figure out how much of this sticks around. And then the other is this like I really don't want anyone to interpret this as we will recover, this stuff just fades away, because we know from like Pakistan work and elsewhere, it doesn't always. Yeah, so that's it.
Hey, Julius, you're up. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know how many of us would want to follow Abhijeet, especially Abhijeet, who was trying to outdo Dev.
We're just going to throw your whole slide back out.
Yeah, so please don't raise your expectations at all. Not anywhere close.
You can give people time to breathe.
Okay, so thank you. So I'm presenting work. This is joint work with Mikiko Nishimura from the International Christian University in Japan and Diana Winter from Elevate Education in Uganda. And this is work that is funded by the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science under its Kakenhi program. And the implementers of this work in Uganda are Elevate Education. So has COVID-19 changed the educational landscape in developing countries? Evidence under school closures in Uganda. So first of all, background. March 2020, we had just started out something in Uganda. We were following up on positive deviance studies that Twaweza had been carrying out. Twaweza did some ethnographic studies in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and asking PD practices and strategies. And so as Twaweza was transiting out of education, I wrote a proposal and said, okay, now we know some of those strategies. Can we extend them to neighboring schools and then test and see how much learning can those buy us? And so I wrote a proposal for an RCT and submitted it, and it was accepted. So the plan was, okay, let's do this RCT and try to establish the impacts. But obviously COVID came in and hit. And so we began by thinking, okay, this is going to go away very soon. And so let's just wait it out. And it was March, and it was April, and it was May. So I said, oh, the good thing I was already locked down in Uganda. So then it was like, okay, we cannot just sit and wait. So what did we do? Rethink the plan. So we thought of the plan and adapted it to remote implementation. Obviously, children were in homes, and so we said, what can we do? But we wanted to maintain the positive deviance roots of the original study. So that should be kept in mind. So the need was to support remote learning. Children were at home and they needed to be supported, and the outcomes of interest were the same, except now we had to include the need to have all children return to school once schools reopen. So the intention is that after COVID has gone away and schools have reopened, we will go back to the original plan of the RCT. As you know, Uganda closed schools for 2 years, and I thought, I'm really shocked to hear that in Tamil Nadu it's almost a replica, exactly almost the same thing happened. But 2 years, completely closed, especially for the lower primary school. I mean, the lower classes, grade 1 to grade 3. They never returned to school until January 2021. So briefly about Twaweza's positive deviance studies in East Africa. These were done in all the 3 countries. And I'm not dwelling on this slide, but the point I'm taking from here is that once you read through those specific PD strategies or practices that they identified, you find that there are 2 main threads that are coming out from all the 3 country studies. One, linking the school to the community. I mean, strengthening that connection. And there are individual practices in there. This is not a PD presentation, I won't dwell on it. And then secondly, creating a supportive environment at the school to support the teachers and the children. Those were the big strategies. So this is Busoga sub-region, and the focus of this work is in Busoga sub-region. This is just to characterize that sub-region. And so this is what I'm going to dwell on. The COVID response, what we did in terms of the adapted implementation of what we wanted to do. So down here you see the response from government and the international community. Once COVID hit, what did government do? Provide some self-study materials at home, run lessons on radio and TV, and run pullouts in newspapers for those who can afford to read the newspapers, pull out some education stuff. So this is government responding. And then from high up there, what we decided to do was to come in and support parents in terms of they have children at home, but they're having issues. We want to support them. How did we support them? We conducted radio talk shows. We said, okay, we'll form panels, go into radios, FM radios, I mean a panel with a teacher, head teacher, and parent, and then address the issues that parents and children are facing in homes. And that's what we did, really. That was the remote adaptation I was talking about. But in the second phase of closures in 2021, we created a forum for head teachers. So we created a forum for head teachers and kind of instigated conversations amongst them via WhatsApp. And then on the basis of the issues that were being discussed, try to see what schools can do. But we encouraged listenership to the radio talk shows, so that's why we did this randomized random assignment or encouragement of households to tune in. I mean, you can't say don't tune into the radio talk show, but if you encourage those that you have encouraged, then you can sometimes, at some point, identify how effective was that. So these are pictures from some of those radio talk shows. The one on the extreme right is the very first talk show. So that was in August 2020. The gentleman on the extreme right is a head teacher. Next to him is a teacher. And then the lady in the middle is the moderator. So the way we do this is that Elevate is the NGO that is running this implementation, but we work with CBOs that are in those districts. So this lady is a member from the CBO, and they're the ones who facilitate these conversations on radio. Then the next gentleman is a parent, and then the gentleman on the extreme left is a representative of Elevate Education. So what did we see? I mean, what did we do in these talk shows? So this is phase one in 2020. So we did 12 radio talk shows, and you can see the themes that we were focusing on at each radio talk show. And then the column that I want us to focus on is the extreme right column, where we are seeing the number of responses in terms of the talk show would be 1 hour long on a Saturday, and we would promote it really, we would run adverts. Please tune in tomorrow at midday. We will be talking about this. We'll bring teachers and parents. They will share their experiences. They'll answer your questions. You also share what you're doing to resolve the challenges that you're facing to facilitate your children to remain engaged with learning. So these are the callers that would call in, and you can see the kind of themes that would be focusing on that attracted the most number of calls, then you'd understand this issue is more important at that time. And all these topics where it's like we didn't really sit down and design the topics for the next 6 months. No, it was about what is the issue now. And then the response we get determines what next week's focus will be, something like that. So in 2021, the same thing we did in phase 2 of the closures. Again, look at the focus of the cause. But you can see that the issues that are really of great importance in terms of the cause. And those cause would be like someone calls and completely disagrees with what you're saying, or gives their own experience of how things are playing out, or asks a question and they want to understand. So they were really engaging. So how about the online teacher support forums for the head teachers? So the reason we added this in 2021 was, first of all, we saw that originally our plan was to support teachers in school. When schools closed, obviously we couldn't do that, but we would access head teachers in the second phase, and we wanted them to know that not all schools had actually closed. Because some of the things we saw in phase 1 is that PD schools, some of them said, okay, schools are officially closed, but I will open my school and tell parents and teachers or children that if you have any issue, come and there will be someone at school to help you. So we wanted all those messages also to be passed on to other head teachers who had just fallen back and said, we shall wait until when the openings will happen. So the data is both qualitative and quantitative, but the focus of this presentation is really the qualitative side of things. So data analysis, for the qualitative analysis, we follow Saldana. We did some coding of the transcripts of the talk shows and also the archived conversations on WhatsApp, and then generated themes, and then got some narratives, and then do some small, some descriptive statistics to show some of those surveys what they were showing us. So on the descriptives to begin with, so early on in 2020, and these numbers are really small, but you could see this was like to see what is happening at the time we were beginning out once we had adapted our plan. And so you see that there was a lot of confusion in homes, but the response were like many of the children, the reach in terms of the packages that the ministry had distributed was so small. Many parents were complaining, we don't know where these stuff that the ministry is saying has distributed, they haven't reached us, and so on and so forth. But you would also see that when we asked parents, okay, how are you supporting the learning? It was like, okay, for the young children, it's mainly the elder children that are supporting, but also others are saying, we are doing nothing, we don't know what to do, actually we're in confusion. 1 year later, those views had changed in a positive way. So you could see that some parents were reporting that teachers have been visiting their homes and telling them what to do, guiding them, and also supporting the children. But also sibling support was becoming more prominent, and this was being reported also at school. You could see that the schools were saying, yeah, we are going into the homes and we are engaging with the parents and the children. And now we just did our midline in February this year. Once schools opened, 1 month later, we went there and did a midline. We also tested children, but we don't report on that in this presentation. But the point of this, of sharing these descriptives, is that we are seeing kind of a go back to the situation before COVID. And this is the sad part of this presentation, really. So, okay, radio and TV, it's not like we're asking the frequency of how often are the children in this home attending to radio lessons or TV or revising their notebooks. We're just saying, does this happen? And just the instance of happening, you can see that on the things that were happening during the lockdown, those things are being rolled back, okay? Older sibling support is falling back, is reducing, not so big, but you can see that there's an increase in now saying, okay, they revise their own notebooks. That was like the norm before, okay? And then you look at these other issues here, like teachers or schools which were giving out textbooks, learning children textbooks to go and use them at home. Now schools are rolling back that. They're not doing it anymore. Things like private and remedial classes are now on the increase, as in, they call it remedial, but this is really, you have to pay to be part of this private arrangement. Otherwise, you don't participate. So some of the qualitative other results is that this is a positive that we saw during the lockdown, that the homes had become a normal space for learning. And this is, you might think this should be normal, but it's not really normal in many of these contexts. parents think learning happens at school, home is for other things. So we saw that COVID actually forced this kind of messaging. Secondly, you could see that the involvement of parents in children's learning at home also increased. Like just a parent sitting there with the children as they are listening to the radio lesson, and the parent sits there throughout the lesson. That's very, very important. Relations between parents and teachers and schools got strengthened during the lockdown, not weakened. As in, parents now realize that they needed to know the teachers of their children and they needed to be in touch with them. And teachers reported that when they went into the homes, they were received very well and they really loved the interaction that was happening, something that was not there before COVID. And then after full reopening, as I've just said, we have 24% of households reporting at least one child never returned to school. We see that home study practices were going back to the pre-pandemic normal, schools rolling back on what I've already said, as in declining textbook lending, declining giving of additional home study materials, schools intensifying the provision of remedial classes, and schools reporting large numbers of children who had not returned. And the main reasons are those for no return. So the main point is that COVID-19 happened, yes, and it really led to learning loss. I mean, we've just seen these two presentations. However, it wasn't all a negative. There were some important positives that COVID did to us, especially for a person like me who believes that the household and the community still have a role in the learning of the children. COVID did a lot to bring that message and make it very clear to all the important players and also connect the schools to the parents and the communities. So we see that as schools got shut, many homes opened up for children's learning. And as parents faced this challenge of how to support their children's learning, they reached out to their teachers, and the schools also reached out to the homes. We also see that as foundational learning proved to be more difficult to deliver for the younger children via remote means, new ways or new possibilities became clear that, for example, elder children could support their younger siblings. So the conclusion here is like greater interactions between parents and teachers and schools deepen collaboration. However, obviously, this is the caveat here, the differentiated experience across different households, different schools. It's not like all schools or all households did this. It's like the positive deviance obviously did that. And then on reopening, many children did not return to school. So the positive lessons learned during the COVID-19 closures are being rolled back. So I tried my best to end on a positive note. Michelle always tells me, Julius, we should always end on a positive note. And the only positive note I have here is that first bullet. I wanted to put it last, but I really want to emphasize this. There is a rollback to the pre-pandemic normal, which is really not good. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julius. So next is Sarah online. Do we have Sarah online?
Yeah.
1 second. Great. Hi there, Sarah. 1 second, we'll get your slides up.
Okay, great. Or I shared my screen during the practice here. Let's see. Okay, great.
Whichever you're doing.
Okay, sounds good. How does that look?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. So I couldn't have asked for a better presentation to follow, so I just want to echo Julius's concern. It's hard to follow Julius now, following Abhijeet, following Dave, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I don't know if this sort of Wizard of Oz setup, works in my favor or against me, but thank you so much for the opportunity to present. So just to quickly outline my presentation, I'm going to provide a little bit of the background and motivation. I think, again, this is just really great to follow Julius and build on this theme of parent engagement and understanding the role of households. And then I'm just going to quickly describe the data and sample and methods that we used for this work in Côte d'Ivoire, and then move on to findings and conclusions. So I think as we've all discussed, the pandemic really inspired an increasing interest or building interest in remote and distance learning and ed tech. But I think many of these interventions and initiatives could also be framed as parent engagement. But that aspect of it often receives less attention or less emphasis. And this is true even before the pandemic. So I think, school systems and education systems offer a great structure through which to do intervention and research. But then that often means that, sort of issues or opportunities outside of the classroom receive less emphasis. So just as a quick illustration, from the US context, I think one phenomenon that's very hard to study is homeschooling. So states define and track homeschooling in different ways. There's a real lag on the information. But just to provide a quick illustration, so this is from a Gallup poll, so there's a lot of room for error, but just as initial indication, if we think about the amount of research and discourse that exists on charter schools compared to homeschools, the phenomenon of homeschooling, we might think that there wouldn't be as equal, percent of students engaging in those two, sort of just as a quick illustration. And then also to highlight that, sort of following the pandemic, this might have, really dramatically increased. And then one of the reasons why I highlighted homeschooling was just to recognize that there are a lot of different terms used in this area, and across different contexts, they might mean different things. So in the US context, homeschooling, carries certain connotations. In Latin America, the Caribbean, Aprender en Casa and other initiatives don't necessarily have those connotations, but I think more broadly, our use of the terms like parent engagement, parent involvement, school-home partnerships aren't always very precise or clear. And this makes it really difficult, even before the pandemic, to understand, well, what are we talking about? What kinds of theories of change do we have for these type of issues? And what might lead to our understanding of what activities and factors might be most effective for supporting children's learning. One other quick thing I wanted to mention is that maybe moving forward, it might also in this literature be helpful to potentially differentiate by age. And there's a lot more research and work at the early childhood level, but then understanding as children transition into center-based education, either early childhood or preschool, and then to primary school and beyond, understanding how our conceptualization of parent engagement changes based upon children's learning levels, children's age levels. So there is some really interesting theoretical work and models here to try and unpack and understand. So here's an example that I think is really interesting, putting parent involvement and parent engagement on a continuum or a spectrum, moving towards more meaningful parent engagement. And what they're doing here is showing a sort of inverse relationship between school agency and parent agency. But many of these theories and models really depend upon or refer to a high income setting, right? So here we see the emphasis on parents' evening or sort of parent-teacher conferences, those types of engagements that aren't as familiar. They're just different dynamics in international and low-income settings. So here's a popular model that I think was really useful. This is the Hoover, Dempsey, and Sandler model of parent engagement. And what they're trying to do is explain why parents become involved in children's education, and then how that involvement might potentially make a difference in student outcomes and in student learning. So I think this effort to try to define and classify and unpack what we mean by parent engagement, like again, just to highlight some of the work in this model, the importance of things like modeling, parents itself, rather than, the sort of truism, do as I say, not as I do, but just, the importance of parents signaling and things like that is an important part of our unpacking and understanding the role of households, parents, and other caregivers in influencing children's educational outcomes and learning. So there is some work to do this in international context. So this is from the 6th round of the Mix survey, included some questions on parents' involvement or on the home learning environment. So here we see them distinguishing between school-based parental involvement and home-based parental involvement. I think there's just a lot more that we can do here to understand and recognize how do we define and classify parent engagement? How does that connect to what might, opportunities to explore what could be most effective, the specific activities and influences that can better support children's education and learning, and then also might have, how different theories of change of parent engagement might connect to all education initiatives, given how important parents are, either directly or indirectly. And then I think there's a real opportunity, I really appreciated Michelle's introduction here, thinking about what did we learn during the pandemic and how can that inform us moving forward? So I think in particular, recognizing the importance of parents and other caregivers, recognizing the importance of the home learning environment, I think really came to the fore during the pandemic. And how do we make sure we keep that perspective, even as schools resume, but as we anticipate regular other breaks in schools moving forward. And then one key perspective to keep in mind, I think, is the issue of equity. And I think sometimes we hope that engaging parents is a way in which to counter or mitigate the possible inequality. But is that always the case, or would parent engagement initiatives or interventions actually be exacerbating existing inequality? I think that's a really important question moving forward. So these really motivate my research questions here. And so I'm using both quantitative and qualitative data from Côte d'Ivoire. But I think this is a really great opportunity because no matter what we're doing with parents, I think it should really be grounded in parents' perspectives as well, at least informed by how parents see their role, what do they want to be involved in, what do they think is most important? And so really incorporating parents' activities and what's currently happening and their perspectives and desires into our understanding of parent engagement involvement and the potential for intervention and initiative moving forward. So just to highlight some key takeaways, parents and other caregivers in our survey highlighted lack of motivation as the primary reason or the most popular frequently cited reason as to why children weren't spending more time on education. So I'll unpack that a little bit moving forward. Another thing I really wanted to highlight was in our sample, we found that 20% were reporting that they engaged a private tutor, what they call house teachers in Côte d'Ivoire. And so I think the term shadow education system is often used for the extent of private tutoring. Again, something that just doesn't receive a lot of attention in research or intervention, but could be very prevalent. So thinking about that and learning more about that, I think is really important. And then just one key thing to highlight, just the extensive variation in experiences. So children and households really had a very diverse range of experiences during school closures. And we generally know that to be true during lots of school breaks. So I think, the research on the summer slide and the idea of seeing schools as an equalizing force and that, the diversity of experiences outside of school really lead to some of the key challenges of equity that we're most concerned with. So just to quickly blitz through some of the background here, this is part of IPA's Recover initiative, which was aiming to generate high quality, useful, timely information for decision makers during the pandemic. So in Côte d'Ivoire, this was related to our two partnerships with the Ministry of Employment and Social Protection and the Ministry of Education. We conducted 2 quantitative phone surveys and then 1 qualitative survey that focused explicitly on education. So we were really lucky in Côte d'Ivoire in that we were able to use an existing sample for this work. So we were able to use this existing survey that included phone numbers. And so just to highlight here, we were able to get a 44% response rate for these phone surveys, which just as a point of comparison, in Ghana, as part of Recover, we relied on random digit dialing, and there we had an only 12% response rate. So just, as Abhijeet mentioned, the challenges of phone surveys, persist. It's just, it's a great opportunity. We were very thankful to be able to do them, but, they come with some limitations. So just some quick descriptives, again, trying to move really quickly here, the first round of the survey, second round of the survey. But again, what was most exciting, just comparing some of our basic descriptives to basic demographics to national averages. What was very encouraging about this was we were able to get something of a more representative sample than a lot of other phone surveys, given that we were able to use this pre-existing sample. So in particular, this idea of, so we use the poverty probability index to determine what % of our sample was below Côte d'Ivoire's national poverty line. So you see our sample having 36% compared to a national average of 39%. This is very encouraging given how so many phone surveys skew towards urban, affluent, educated, male. So we were able to get a bit more of a representative sample here for the quantitative survey. So the qualitative survey was not representative. So this was designed to more deeply investigate parents and other caregivers' experience of the school closures, as well as the different distance learning opportunities that were available at the time. And so we actually used the quantitative data to generate this sample. So we asked, parents and other caregivers about the different activities that they were participating in while schools were closed. And then if they did use a particular service, so for example, this is one of the radio programs that was active in Côte d'Ivoire, asking how did they feel about it, or what did they think about that, to be able to generate these different user profiles, because we really wanted to learn about different perspectives and different experiences. And so we developed these different user profiles of who engaged in what types of activities, and then what did they think of them. And then within each of those user profiles, we would randomly select participants to respond to. So that's just a flag that, that was the original motivation for this survey. So this isn't, very representative. It's only 39 respondents. It's a qualitative survey.
Sarah, you have about 4
Yes.
minutes. You have about 4 minutes. 4.5.
Okay, great. Sorry, that just really blitzed through. So very quickly, the school closures just very different compared to the experiences of Uganda and India. This was relatively short, only a few months, actually mimicked the school summer holiday. So some basic descriptive statistics. So 70% of respondents report that all of their primary school children were spending time on education during this period of school closures. We see a slight difference between poor and non-poor households. So non-poor households were more likely to say all children were spending time on education. Poor households, we see about 25% are saying no children are spending any time on education. We don't really see a difference based upon whether they're in the major capital city or metropolitan center. And so again, just this diversity of experience, we have 20% spending more than 10 hours, 50% spending less than an hour a day. So a real spectrum. Some are pretty heavily involved in educational activities, some really aren't at all. So as I mentioned before, we see that lack of motivation was identified most frequently as the reason why children weren't spending more time on education. So this is just how the question was phrased. They're able to identify potentially up to 3 reasons, and the enumerators coded them based upon these different response options. So here's some of the language coming from the qualitative surveys about this issue of motivation, right? That when schools are closed, children think they're on vacation, really emphasizing the role of parents here. If you don't follow them closely, they'll forget everything, right? It really all depends on the parents is what, is coming through in these qualitative interviews. And then again, recognizing that children have other responsibilities, households have other interests. So, this respondent saying, children aren't doing anything when school's out, they're going to the fields. That's what's going on while schools are closed. So it's interesting, this is a bit of a noisy measure. We see some variation, but as at least a point estimate, we see more poor households are identifying no motivation as a barrier to spending more time on education than non-poor households. So I think parents' educational background, their own educational experience can really influence how they're supporting their children or engaging in their children's education, right? So we have a number of parents who are talking about, I don't have the required skills. I was unable to control their work, let alone teach them anything, right? So we definitely see that perspective present in the data. But then we also see different, sort of approaches, right? So here we have a parent talking about, I cannot read, but I can sit next to him when he reads. And even that this is a source of motivation. I didn't go to school, but you will, sort of as long as I have the money to pay for it, because I didn't go to school, you will. So this is an important, I think, sort of complexity to think about in relation to, how parents approach engaging in children's education. But that this is echoed even when schools have resumed. Sort of a lot of parents and caregivers in Cote d'Ivoire are mentioning that it's really important to engage in children's education when they're not in school, even when school's in session, right? So this respondent is saying, if you don't have someone in a household who's going to study with children, it's a wasted effort. That's because teaching is poor and children, have to repeat. And so recognizing that this out of school experience is really important, even when school's open. So this is echoed another respondent here saying, whether it's when children are in school or not, it's the same thing for me. They must be motivated to do school at home. When there's no teacher, they are demotivated at home, right? So this echoing, so this is a really important concern even when schools are open. But just to quickly foreshadow, people weren't universally critical of teachers necessarily, right? So here we have a teacher recognizing that teachers need to be paid a good salary in order to teach effectively in the classroom. I just want to quickly flag that. But return to this point about house teachers, sort of paid tutors. So we have over 20% of households saying that they've engaged a private tutor. And so again, this was referencing periods during school closures, and there was a lockdown in Cote d'Ivoire, so this might be much lower than what might normally be the case. What was interesting was that we really didn't see a difference between poor and non-poor respondents. But in some of the qualitative data I'll show you, this is potentially a concern. So this might be related to our sample or some of the measures. But people saw house teachers as part of the basics that a household could provide. Yeah?
30-second warning.
Okay, great. So I'll just blitz through this. Sorry. So engaging house teacher was seen. So here, even how are you involved? They're interpreting that as whether they engage a house teacher or not. But then again, that maybe, our measure of the national poverty line had over a third of the sample in it, maybe a more restrictive or severe form of poverty. Maybe that's where there might be some difference in engaging house teachers. The discussion of costs associated with attending school more broadly is really important. We generally seen this, really talked about in a lot of Asian contexts, but when you look at available data, there's really high prevalence of other forms of tutoring, refresher courses, extra lessons. There are a lot of different terms depending on what context that you're looked at that, sort of reference this. But that the measurement of this can be very difficult. So here's this example from Zambia, that 2 different forms of measuring end up with wildly different estimates.
Okay,
so this is a really important thing. Okay, great.
Have
so I'll just
one
go with
closing
the
statement.
conclusions. So sorry.
Oh, are you gonna close? You can close it up. Okay.
Yeah, perfectly fine.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Sorry to cut you off there, but yeah. Okay, thanks for all those great presentations. We'll take our 3 presenters from the room up front here. Can we get one more chair? Joe's on it, as always. Great. Okay, so we'll start with a couple questions from the room. And Yue, do we have any questions online yet? Perfect. So we'll start in the room and then go to Abuja Hub after that. So, okay, I'm going to turn to make sure I catch you guys. So Matthew here and there, and then, yeah, right there. We'll start with those 3. So go ahead.
Thanks. The question is really for Abhijeet, but maybe it's general question about how to measure learning loss. I just reflecting on the fact that there's a gap between what you know and what you can do in a test, right? Which is why I understand you economist folk call it test scores rather than learning achievement. And that gap widens the less experience you have of schooling. So I don't know if this is maybe partly what you're saying, but just a really interesting implication of like how recently were you in school being a potential predictor of that gap between performance and achievement.
Thank you. Very interesting presentations. I wish I could say the same thing as Abhijeet was saying for India, Tamil Nadu. Like if we look at data in sub-Saharan Africa and the longitudinal data on the same student, you're basically, the gradient of learning is decreasing post-COVID. So they are coming back to school and they are on top of the losses that have happened because of COVID. You are having additional losses because the teacher is not teaching at the right level. So I wonder if it is the age range that you are basically interviewing in the surveys from the 3 to 10-year-olds. So once the foundational skills have been built and the shock comes in, will there be any implications in terms of like how quickly they recover? Tamil Nadu seems like a very specific experience that you have shown with the interventions that are going on. So how do we place it in the global evidence as what Dev has presented? And one just small.
Thank you so much for that excellent question. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. This question is probably mostly for Julius, probably for Sarah, maybe for Abhijeet, but probably not for Dave. But it's about what Julius observed to do with the community aspect and the kind of the ecological shift in kind of the expectations because of this disruptive event. We did a similar study in Cambodia, and what we found is just at the very end, when everything was going about the community stuff was really going well, and there was this different level of communication, then the parents basically handed the kids back to the teachers when the school's open and said, "Thank you very much, let's just get on with our lives as before." Did anything stay of that exciting shift that you were kind of talking about, or to anybody, if anyone's talking about that?
Great, thanks. And do we have any questions in Abuja that we could take one question from there? And if not, we can come back later.
Okay, thank you. My question is to Davis Evans about learning loss. And you presented a wonderful data about learning loss in low-income countries and for high-income countries. But I'm just curious about 2 particular things. Like if we try to compare the learning loss of rich children in low-income countries, if we compare that to the learning loss of poor children in high-income countries, what sort of results do we expect to get?
Great question. Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we'll just maybe start down with Abhijeet for a couple of those, and we'll go in order and go to Sarah last.
Yeah, so the first thing that Matthew asked. So I do think some of this is probably things like test familiarity, but I don't actually think that's the primary explanation, because a whole bunch of these items are sort of oral administration, right? So it's the interviewer reading something out to the kid, it's one-to-one responses. So in that sense, I expect those effects to be smaller on assessments like this than they would have been if, for instance, we were testing middle school kids in written exams, okay? But clearly, some element of that, and that's the kind of convergence that I would have expected to pick up anyway. I don't think there's any version of it that ends up looking as rapid as what we're seeing, and I don't quite know what to make of it, but or I have hypotheses, but I do not have well-identified evidence, so I'm unwilling to speculate too much. Coming to Salman's question, so did the gradients grow? So part of it, is this too Tamil Nadu specific? It's as large as Germany, it should count, right? I mean, there's so much of what we base everything on learning loss is based on schools in Belgium that were shut for a 3-week period, right? I mean, for a very long time, that was the only identified thing that we had to go on. So not apologetic on that at all. How should we put this in the global evidence space? I wish I knew, right? I mean, so a lot of what is happening in Tamil Nadu, and that's the bit that I wanted to bring along descriptively, is exceptional even within India and may well be outside, right? So the schools, the government schools have oriented towards thinking these 3 months are entirely remedial, right? So they're not following the same thing. They used the school closure period to develop a whole bunch of curricular and textbook material. They got the personnel systems organized to hire 180,000 people in 2 months, right? And the ability to deliver that much at scale with the chief ministers on the radio, everyone. So very little of this is available in the English language, which is a disadvantage because I also do not speak Tamil, but thankfully various people on our team do. So a lot of what we did in preparatory work was them translating Tamil documents into English so that I could read them and figure out what's happening. So that's one thing I don't want anyone to take away from this, is that the learning loss is something that will just go away. I don't think that's what we're learning here, but I thought this is important enough that we should present what we have to the extent we have. And yeah, I don't know all the answers on this one.
Great. Okay, Dave, and I think there was one directed at you, but then I think also this point that Matthew brought up about the test taking might also apply to maybe some of the data that you've looked at.
So yeah, great. So also, I'm just curious on your point, Salman, about you mentioned that the data we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa on, I'm very curious, I haven't seen longitudinal post-pandemic sort of like lots of multiple rounds from multiple countries. So I don't know, anyway, I'd be interested whether here or offline to know where those estimates stem from. On our question from Abuja, this is a great question. So I'd have to go back and look at the estimates. I'd actually wager, though, quite confidently that the learning loss that we would observe is lower amongst rich kids in low-income countries than amongst poor kids in high-income countries. But it's important to combine that with learning levels, right? So the learning levels are much lower. So, so we talk about learning loss in the wake of COVID, and that's really important, and we should. But a huge part of the learning crisis is not about the COVID learning loss. It's about that kids, especially kids in the poorest income environments, were way behind. And so even if their learning loss is a little bit less in the context of COVID, which I think is possible, their learning levels are way lower than what we see in high income environments. And so the learning crisis still is very much in full force despite that. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So Julius, the one on community aspects, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, Simon. So one of the things that really had happened in the communities that we're in and what we saw that to me brought some smile on my face was like, you know what, schools find it very difficult to lend out textbooks to kids to go and use at home. Really, really difficult. And in those schools that show that they were doing this, we thought this was really so nice. So to see the data we just picked in January, and this was just 1 month after schools had reopened, that this was being scaled back is something that I felt like, okay, did they find that, because one of the things that we learned during the closure was that head teachers were telling us that they would ask parents, so if the child wants to borrow the book, they would ask the parents to commit that they will secure that textbook, and the textbook will come back, cover it and keep it in the setting in which it is, so that it will come back to the school and so on and so forth. So to see that now, schools are like, no, we are no longer lending out textbooks, or that incidence of lending out textbook is reducing is really, yeah, but I think, I would say it was still very early when we went in February. I don't know if that has completely gone away, but that's one of the things that really felt so bad, yeah.
Great. And Sarah, do you want to come in on any of these kind of community/parent dynamics?
Sure, yeah, I think one of the things that was really interesting, not even just about this study in Cote d'Ivoire, but in other places, when we asked parents, would you like these services to continue? Radio, television, many of them said no. They said, you know, like, oh, when schools are open, you know, we don't necessarily need that. That wasn't true across the board. You know, there's some variation there. But then I think that's really interesting compared to these things like house teachers and refresher courses and all these other sort of natural informal systems that are going on. And so I think that's a really important question, like how parents saw these recent school breaks as a deviation from the norm and then going back to the norm. How do they see their role? And I think that's this interesting question. Many parents identify very strongly as providers, right? And so they want to be able to provide educational opportunities for their children, but then not all parents see themselves as wanting to play the teaching role, being the teacher. And yet how many of these different educational interventions ask that of parents? So thinking about how to sort of meet in the middle or build on these naturally occurring dynamics that are happening, I think is a way to really keep and better understand and further investigate, you know, these different avenues for meaningful parent and community engagement.
Great. Okay, let's do another round. Yui, do we have any questions from online? Yeah. Okay. Anyone over here? You have a chance. No. Okay.
You missed Alexis the first time.
Oh, did I miss you the first time? Okay, so you can go, and I know Nick had his hand up. Okay. Now people are just advocating for themselves. I don't know. Okay, so we'll go to you, and then sure. Okay, I'll support the initiative there. And Felipe, okay, and then we'll do one last round. I think we'll have plenty of time for another round. So go ahead first.
Yeah, I think it's a question mostly for Dave, but maybe it applies also to other ones. I mean, so I'm working with some EMIS data set from Togo and Cote d'Ivoire, where I've got now the data, like the post-COVID data. So I can see the enrollment, the level of enrollment in those countries. And so I can see, you know, what happened. And also I can see what happened in the exam data. And so Togo, nothing happened in the exam, but the only thing that I can see in Togo is that there are fewer kids enrolling in grade 1 of primary school. It's a small effect, like 5% less than pre-pandemic, but it's still something that I think which wouldn't be picked up by what you saw there. And my question is, did you see something like that? And in Cote d'Ivoire, the effect is like they went from like 80-85% success rate in their primary school leaving exam to like 50%, like 60, between 50 and 60%. So there's a massive drop. And I know the quality, and I know the difficulty of the exam can change, but it was super consistent before the pandemic, and now they lost like 30 or 20, or like 20 or 30 points. And you know, talking like to the Ministry of Education in Cote d'Ivoire, they say, oh, we haven't changed the exam. I mean, just like the kids are not as good as before. And maybe you don't pick it ever, but it's obviously has a big consequences for kids. You know, maybe there's a tiny drop, you know, in learning, but maybe it's a massive drop in success rate, and they will never finish primary school because of that. So I was wondering if you saw that in some of your studies.
Great, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Joshua over here. First of all, just to agree with Simon, and therefore to kind of encourage Dave and all of us here to really think about other more comprehensive ways of really teasing this issue of learning loss out, because the impact out there is huge. Apart from learning loss that is taking place amongst the learners that have immediately returned to school, there are learners that did not immediately return to school. And there are learners that we are still chasing at the moment. I can give an example of a country. We have lost 400,000 learners out of 6 million learners. That's a huge figure. So COVID-19 impacts are really huge, and we really need to study further. And longitudinal studies like what Simon has done and others hopefully maybe have done elsewhere would be very, very helpful to augment the great studies that we have done so far. So let's interact further on this. And the last one,
No, thank you. We're gonna go to Felipe. No, I'm sorry, but one comment, question each. Felipe, go ahead. I gave you an extra one already.
This is kind of a controversial idea, and I want to hear from the panel. On one hand, you are claiming that there is a substantial loss for low-income individuals. On the other hand, this conference has been all the time saying, hey, there is very little learning that happened for poor people. So I am wondering where are the numbers coming? The math doesn't match. So this is the hypothesis that what you are measuring is not learning, but cognitive impact, which I want to distinguish learning from cognitive. And two channels that can happen is that, first of all, kids choose to receive nutrients and food from the schools, and that was shut down during pandemic. The second one, kids are in environment in which probably there is more tension, more violence, and that can also affect cognitive. So I was wondering, when I hear from you all, is that, hey, you're saying that there is loss for the poor, and we don't think that there is that much learning in the school. So are we seeing really learning loss? So it was controversial.
Great question on that kind of seeming or perceived contradiction. Do I understand that there's another question from Abuja? Yeah, okay, great. We'll take one question there and then I'll turn it to the panel. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, my question is to Evans. Okay, which is about the learning loss, the different dimension. I want to ask about what do you think, what is the role of data availability? For instance, in the existing literature, we observe that study on low-income countries, especially Africa, is missing because we don't really have comparable data sets. What do you think going forward, even this COVID scenario? Because it is difficult for us to really ascertain to what magnitude is learning loss. And also, what do you think about using unstandardized data in doing this kind of study? Thank you very much.
Quite a fefew questions there on kind of digging in a little deeper on the learning loss and enrollment. So I think a lot of those, Dave, are going to go to you, maybe a little bit Abhijeet, but in the sense of I think this will be our last round, so to make sure that the others come in too. Maybe a question for me as the chair, but to Abhijeet and Julius and Sarah, maybe a reflection from each of you also on how you see carrying some of these lessons forward, and specifically, Abhijeet, if these impacts on ketchup that we're seeing reflect even something that's moderately real. I know you're very clear that these aren't causal identification of but say half the impact is the result of this program. Those are pretty impressive learning gains relative to what we see in a non-emergency crisis. So what are maybe some of the lessons that we could carry forward? And on the kind of parental community dynamics, what lessons would you guys say, particularly picking up maybe on some of these equity implications that we've touched on a little bit? Does anyone want to, actually Dave, let's start with you, because you put up a number of the questions.
Yeah, thanks. These are great questions, more questions than I probably have good answers to. But so Alexi, on your point, so one thing I'll say, so I haven't seen data from Togo, that's really interesting. I believe in South Africa, we did see the same phenomenon of under-enrollment in early grades, like lower enrollment than you've seen in the past in early grades. So I think that's not a unique phenomenon, even though most of the dropout that I've seen documented has been for adolescents. On Cote d'Ivoire, so there is some published work on dropout rates, which finds very low rates of dropout rates by Dupont and others. But I think this is very interesting, and it's an important distinction between there's learning loss, and then there are things like pass rates, which are these discrete, it's not the percentage of kids who can, read a sentence, it's whether or not kids pass what is often a very high stakes exam that has huge implications for sort of what happens next. And I think we just have seen much less of that so far. I'm gonna jump ahead to the question from Abuja about, just in terms of research availability, I think that's I think it's a great question. And we just don't have enough data for most countries. And there was a comment on Sub-Saharan Africa specifically. And it's true, right? We have Uganda, we have that UNESCO study of about 6 countries. And neither of these are like super well identified because exactly this point that there's just limited research availability. So we should be very hesitant to say like, oh, there isn't that much learning loss because there are just very few countries. I do think we also need to be open to our priors being upset once we do measure it, and maybe there is less learning loss than we expect based on anecdotes, but we certainly can't say that now. So I absolutely agree, and I think the standardization of data is an important question, and what you see with a lot of the studies that have come out so far, and we'll see a change, like the quality of studies on learning loss will improve over the course of the next 12 months because there will be better data and people will have more time to actually analyze it in a more responsible way. A lot of what we have so far really are people do some pretty quick and dirty analysis and put it out. I think that's useful and important, but there are, I think, they've signaled, some caveats. And then I'll just say a last word on Felipe's point, which is, an important one, then I'll shut up. So I don't actually see the contradiction. So there is learning happening in poor environments. There is not nearly enough learning happening in poor environments, right? But there is learning happening. Like kids, we don't see in most environments that like 0% of kids can read, after 3 years of school, or even 0% of the poorest kids. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the learning crisis with that. That's a very modest statement. And so when we don't see in those initial Uganda estimates, right, we don't see average learning loss, we see a doubling of the kids who can't identify a single letter, right? This is the most basic of reading skills. That's the very first skill, right? So under normal circumstances, that's happening for a lot of kids. A lot of kids do learn to read a letter. Now, learning to read a letter doesn't help you that much with getting a job and functioning in society. That's why it's the first step, right? But I would just say, so I actually don't think there's necessarily a contradiction. I think that the poorest kids are losing the most learning of what learning they were gaining before, which wasn't nearly enough.
Thanks. Okay, to the other three, a closing remark. It can be on whichever question you choose.
Oh, right.
So you can
on
choose
Felipe's
which
question,
one.
I more or less agree with Dave, and I know Felipe, so I can just catch up over coffee. On the specific bit on how do we carry lessons from this forward, I really want to stress the fact that these aren't causal estimates, and I'll tell you why that matters. It matters because I cannot tell you at this moment, what if it was all that was required was reorienting the school and how that was functioning, and the supplementary instruction had no role, versus maybe the school stuff did nothing and everything. Don't know. The one thing in terms of carrying stuff forward is that as the quality of COVID studies is getting better, interest in COVID studies is declining off a cliff. And I just want to make the pitch that we will not know what the impacts of this crisis are till at least a year and a half from now. Okay? So.
Okay, we're over time, but Sarah and Julius, I'm not going to leave you hanging. You can make a closing remark as well, if you'd like.
Do you want to go first?
You go ahead, and I'll go to Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So for me, it's two takeaways, really. So first, that COVID taught us that the family, the home, the parents have a role. And they can they can contribute directly to learning. So we shouldn't really think, we just have to do it in school, through teachers and schools only. They have a role, and they can do something. Secondly, that there are other affordable ways of improving foundational learning. And if the lessons we've got from Uwezo and Pratham are anything to go by, working with people that are available in the communities and available in an affordable way. And from this study of ours, we find that, for children in lower primary grades who never went to school for 2 years, siblings became important in helping them. Means there are solutions that probably we are not even exploring, and they are available and accessible.
Thank you, Julius. Sarah, any closing remark?
Yeah, sure. I think just building off of that, and then one other about the importance of these environments outside of school, and that in many countries there's school is still just a half day, or there are lots of breaks, either due to elections or regularly scheduled program. This is something, I think that perspective is really important moving forward. And then just, some of these other questions that just allowing for variation across these different contexts, that not only were the breaks and disruptions dramatically different and then experienced within those contexts in different ways, But then, you know, I think the point that was made earlier by someone in the audience about the return to school looking very different, and just that even in the status quo, high rates of absenteeism, people take, you know, 2 or 3 weeks to enroll, and then they only attend just for exams, just that, you know, the hold on access might be more tenuous than we think it is. And then just, you know, sort of allowing for that diversity and variation in understanding these experiences.
Thanks. Okay, how about a round of applause for our panel? One quick announcement as we go to coffee. I know I'm keeping you from coffee, but just a quick announcement is that some of you have probably seen this, and especially on Twitter, but there's a new learning poverty report out. We have one of the distinguished authors in the room with us, but a new one out, this time co-authored by even a slightly larger group. It's the World Bank, UNICEF, FCDO, USAID, and Gates, providing new numbers on learning poverty. So figured that would be of interest to a lot of people in this room and wanted to put it on everyone's radar. With that, please go enjoy your last coffee break. Thank you.